The bell hadn't rung. It was a peculiar thing to note, but Detective Juno Fraser had learned long ago that it was often the smallest details that unlocked the greatest mysteries. As she entered the estate, the first thing she noticed was the silence. No ringing of a doorbell, no servants' voices calling from behind closed doors. Just an eerie quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. The death of Lord Clarence Hargrove had shocked the town of Ascot. A man of wealth and influence, he was known for his eccentricities and obsession with clocks, his vast collection of rare artifacts, and his love for riddles. But it was the manner of his death that had baffled everyone. He had been found in his study, slumped in a chair with a glass of brandy still in his hand, and yet there was no indication of foul play, no signs of struggle, no poisons, no wounds. The cause of death was labeled as a heart attack, yet something felt wrong. The crime scene had been meticulously cleaned. There were no signs of forced entry, and no fingerprints, no hair, nothing that suggested anyone had been there at all. Only one detail stood out: a small brass bell on the desk, just beside Lord Hargrove's chair, but the bell, curiously, hadn't rung. Fraser was used to unusual cases. Her mind always sought patterns where others saw chaos. She was a stickler for detail and loved to tie every loose end together, no matter how seemingly insignificant. This case, however, was different. She turned to the butler, Samuel, who had been present when the body was discovered. "Did you hear the bell ring, Samuel? It's strange, isn't it?" The butler blinked. "The bell, ma'am? It's never rung in my time here. Lord Hargrove had no use for it. It was purely decorative." "I believe. Then why was it placed on the desk?" Fraser asked, her brow furrowing. There was something about the bell, its polished surface catching the light, that unsettled her. It seemed far too deliberate. Before Samuel could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A tall, young man with a pale face entered the room. It was Lord Hargrove's nephew, Philip, a thin, nervous-looking man with an air of someone who always seemed to be trying to hide something. "Detective Fraser, I presume," he said, his voice high-pitched and unsure. Fraser nodded, eyeing him carefully. "Yes, Mr. Hargrove. I've been asked to investigate the circumstances surrounding your uncle's death." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the desk. It's all so strange. The fact that he died so suddenly, and in his own home. We thought the house was safe. My uncle was particular about his security. "Tell me about the bell," Fraser said, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Why was it on the desk?" Philip's expression faltered. "The bell? I don't know. It wasn't there when I last visited. My uncle had a fondness for odd trinkets, but I don't recall seeing it in his collection." Fraser stepped closer to the desk, studying the bell once more. There was something wrong with it, an inexplicable presence, like it was waiting for something to happen. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you have any idea what happened to your uncle in the hours before his death?" He hesitated, then replied, "I don't know." He had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. He spoke of threats, though he never said from whom. I assumed it was just the ramblings of an old man. He didn't have enemies, at least none that I knew of. Fraser's mind raced. A man of his stature, speaking of threats, but no sign of anyone who could have been the cause. And then the bell, the silent, passive clue. "Is there anyone else who could have been in this house recently?" she asked. Philip nodded hesitantly. "There were the servants, of course, but none of them would do anything like this. And then there's Jane, my aunt. She had been upset about something, but I never heard the details." "Your aunt?" Fraser asked. "What was she upset about?" "She and my uncle were not on the best terms. There was talk of a divorce, but I never thought it was serious enough to." Fraser's gaze was fixed on the bell again. "Did she ever mention this bell?" Philip shook his head. "No. Why would she?" Fraser took a deep breath, feeling the puzzle begin to take shape. The silence in the room was overwhelming, the kind of quiet that made one's thoughts feel dangerously close to the edge of reason. Everything seemed to point in one direction, but the bell, the small, odd clue, remained the key to understanding it all. Just as she was about to ask Philip to clarify a few more details, the sound of the door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. A woman entered, her face pinched with worry. She wore a dark dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. It was Jane, Lord Hargreaves' estranged wife. "I heard you were here, detective," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I need to speak with you. There's something you must understand about my husband's death." Fraser glanced at the bell one last time before turning her attention to Jane. "What is it, Mrs. Hargrove?" Jane's eyes darted to the desk, and for a fleeting moment, she looked almost fearful. Then, with a deep sigh, she began to speak. "Clarence, he was obsessed with time. He had this theory that he'd been working on for years. He believed that time itself was a prison, that it controlled him, rather than the other way around. He thought that if he could stop the passage of time, he could escape it." Fraser leaned in closer. "And the bell, does it have anything to do with this theory?" Jane's hands trembled as she nodded. Yes, he had planned to ring it at the moment of his death. He thought that the bell would signal the moment he broke free of time's grasp. But it never rang. Fraser stood motionless, her mind processing the impossible connection. The bell had been a trigger, a device to mark the moment of death, but it had never been used. What if Lord Hargreaves' death wasn't an accident? What if it was deliberate? Had he truly died of a heart attack, or was there something more sinister at play? The bell that didn't ring was no mere trinket. It was the key to unlocking the entire mystery. Fraser stood silently for a long moment, processing Jane Hargreaves' words. There was something in her tone, something hesitant, as if she feared that the truth she was revealing might not be enough to answer all the questions swirling around the room. The bell was clearly more than a mere object. It was a symbol, an integral part of Lord Hargreaves' warped perception of time. But the deeper question remained: did he really die of natural causes, or had something or someone interfered with his plan? As the seconds ticked by, the room's quiet tension seemed almost unbearable. But Fraser wasn't one to let silence become a barrier. She'd learned long ago that, when it came to solving a case, the smallest observations were often the most significant, and this silence was filled with unanswered questions, with hints she could sense, but not yet fully grasp. "Mrs. Hargrove," Fraser said, her voice calm but deliberate, "you mentioned that your husband believed he could escape time. Was this belief something that only came up recently, or had he been fixated on it for a long time?" Jane's face tightened, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of her dress. It started a few months ago. At first, I thought it was just one of his usual eccentricities, something to pass the time. But it grew more intense as the days went by. He became obsessed with his clocks. He'd sit for hours, staring at them, measuring each second. He told me once that he felt trapped in time, that every second was like a chain around his neck. Fraser nodded thoughtfully, watching Jane closely. There was sincerity in her voice, but a trace of unease that seemed out of place. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she was avoiding looking directly at the bell, the way her gaze flickered nervously toward the chair where her husband had died. "And the bell?" Fraser asked again, her eyes narrowing. "Did you know he intended to use it as part of this plan?" Jane hesitated for a moment too long, her fingers tightening in her lap. I didn't know about the bell specifically, but yes, he was always speaking of symbols, things that marked significant moments. I suppose the bell was just one of those things." The detective's keen eyes caught the slight shift in Jane's posture, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a glance at the door, a slight twitch of the hand. Something didn't sit right. It was subtle, but Fraser trusted her instincts. Jane's words, while plausible, seemed to have an undertone of something unspoken, a hesitation that couldn't be ignored. But there was still one more question that needed answering. "Where were you when your husband died?" Fraser asked, her voice steady but sharp. She could feel the weight of the question pressing on the room, but she didn't flinch. This was part of the process, the next step in unraveling the mystery. Jane stiffened slightly, but regained composure quickly. "I was in my room. I heard nothing until the servants discovered him. I wasn't close enough to hear the bell. If it had rung." Fraser nodded. "And the servants, where were they?" "Scattered about the house, doing their duties. I'm sure Samuel can provide you with their exact locations," Jane replied, her voice now laced with the faintest trace of impatience. if you have no more questions. Detective, I'll be in the drawing room. Fraser watched as Jane swiftly exited the room, leaving an almost palpable sense of unease in her wake. But it wasn't just Jane's reaction that had unsettled her. It was the room itself, the clues lying hidden in plain sight. The detective turned her attention back to the desk, her gaze lingering on the brass bell. The object seemed almost out of place, like a prop in a play, a prop that had been purposefully ignored, yet still carried a heavy weight in the unfolding drama. She picked it up carefully, feeling its cold, smooth surface. It was beautifully crafted, intricate, and old, its craftsmanship far beyond anything one would expect from a simple trinket. As Fraser examined the bell, something caught her eye. A faint, almost imperceptible mark on the underside. It was a small scratch, barely visible unless one looked very closely. No ordinary mark. This was something done with intent, a pattern that had been purposefully etched into the metal. But why? She let the bell slip from her fingers back onto the desk and walked over to the window, glancing out at the sprawling estate beyond. The grounds were calm, still, the garden stretching out like a peaceful tableau. But her mind was racing. There had to be more to this, something she was missing. She turned back toward the room, her thoughts sharp and focused. The puzzle pieces were slowly beginning to click together. There was one more thing she needed to confirm. The servant Samuel. She needed to speak with him, and quickly. It didn't take long for Samuel to arrive in the study, his tall, imposing figure filling the doorway. His expression was serious, yet his eyes betrayed a trace of worry. He seemed intent on hiding. "Yes, detective?" he asked, his voice deep and measured, but carrying an edge that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable. "Samuel, I need you to walk me through what happened when you discovered Lord Hargrove's body," Fraser said, her voice calm but insistent. The butler hesitated before answering. "I came into the study to bring Lord Hargrove his morning tea. It was then that I found him, slumped in his chair. The glass of brandy in his hand hadn't even spilled. It seemed like he had simply passed away in his sleep." Fraser's gaze narrowed. "And the bell, did it ring?" Samuel stiffened slightly, his eyes flickering to the desk. "No, ma'am, the bell had not rung." "Have you ever seen it there before?" Fraser asked, her voice gentle but probing. Samuel took a deep breath, his eyes now avoiding hers. "No, detective, the bell was never on that desk. I have worked here for many years, and I know my master's habits. That bell was never there before." Fraser studied him carefully. There was something in his response that wasn't adding up. His body language was too guarded, too rehearsed. He wasn't telling her everything. "Samuel," Fraser said, her tone firm now, "were you in the study before you found the body?" The butler's eyes flashed with something that almost looked like guilt, and in that instant, Fraser knew he was hiding something more than just his unease about the bell. "No, ma'am," he replied quickly, but the lie hung in the air like a dense fog. Fraser felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the truth. Samuel had been in the study before. He had seen the bell, perhaps even moved it. And if he had been there before the body was discovered, then his account was compromised. The bell had not only failed to ring, but it had also been placed on the desk with a purpose that was beginning to unravel with every passing second. Fraser stepped closer to Samuel, her eyes locking with his. "Tell me the truth, Samuel. What really happened in this room?" The butler's face paled, and for a brief moment, he faltered. But the detective had him now. Slowly, a confession began to form on his lips, and with it, the final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed. Fraser watched Samuel, the butler, standing rigidly before her, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. His previous composure had cracked, revealing the unease she had sensed earlier. He was trying to maintain a facade of calm, but there was something about his nervous energy that suggested more than mere guilt. "You've been in this study before, Samuel," Fraser said, her voice smooth, almost coaxing. "Before you discovered Lord Hargrove's body, didn't you?" The butler hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if he were searching for an escape. But Fraser's gaze remained unwavering, patient, knowing that this moment was crucial. She could almost see the gears turning in his mind, trying to decide whether to confess or deny. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he muttered, "Yes, ma'am, I was in here earlier. I brought Lord Hargrove his tea." Fraser raised an eyebrow, and the bell, Samuel's lips, trembled slightly. It was already there, detective. I didn't touch it. I swear it." Fraser studied him for a long moment, taking in the subtle twitch of his hands, the quickened pace of his breath. She could tell he was lying, but the question was, why? Why would he lie about something as trivial as the bell? Could it be that it wasn't just the bell he was trying to conceal? Before she could press him further, the door creaked open, and a man stepped into the room. Philip Hargrove, Lord Hargrove's nephew. His expression was strained, and he seemed to be in a hurry. His eyes flickered between Fraser and Samuel, and there was an almost tangible tension in the air. "I am sorry to interrupt," Philip stammered, his voice nervous, "but I thought I should speak with you, detective. I have something to add." Fraser gave him a long, appraising look before nodding. "What is it, Mr. Hargrove?" Philip swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about my uncle's death, and I realize now there's something I didn't tell you earlier. Something that's important." Fraser's gaze sharpened, sensing an opening. "Go on." Philip hesitated again, his hands wringing together in front of him. "The night before my uncle died, I overheard a conversation between him and someone. It was late, and I was in the hallway outside his study. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. He was speaking to someone on the phone. I only heard one side of the conversation, but it sounded urgent." Fraser leaned forward, intrigued. "What did he say?" Philip's voice faltered as he repeated the words he had overheard. He said, "I know what you're planning. Don't think for a second I'll let you get away with it. I'm prepared for whatever comes next." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Fraser felt her pulse quicken. The mention of a plan, of preparation, it was all too familiar. Lord Hargrove had been expecting something or someone, and he'd been ready to confront it. But who had he been speaking to? Did he mention a name? Fraser asked, her voice tight with focus. Philip shook his head. "No, I didn't hear the name. But it was clear from the tone of the conversation that whoever it was, my uncle knew them." He seemed angry, but also calm, like he had everything under control. Fraser processed this information, her mind racing. Someone had been threatening Lord Hargrove. But who and why? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit, but the full picture remained elusive. And now there was this strange, almost paradoxical detail. If Lord Hargrove had known about the danger, why had he been so unprepared for it? Why had he died so suddenly and quietly, without a struggle? Before she could delve deeper into these questions, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Detective, are you done with him?" Samuel's voice was almost pleading, his unease palpable. He shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Fraser glanced at him, but didn't acknowledge his discomfort. "Not yet. Mr. Hargrove, I'll need to speak to you again shortly. Please wait in the drawing room." Philip nodded quickly, his gaze darting between the detective and Samuel, before he turned and exited the room without another word. Fraser returned her attention to the butler, her sharp eyes never leaving him. She could feel that he was hiding something critical. "Samuel," she said, her tone now cold and direct, "you told me you brought Lord Hargrove his tea earlier that morning, but you didn't mention the fact that you were in here the night before his death. Why is that?" Samuel flinched, his hands twitching again. I didn't think it was important. I only came in to clean, ma'am. Lord Hargrove didn't want to be disturbed that night, and he was in a strange mood. He kept talking to himself, muttering about clocks and time. I didn't want to intrude." Fraser's eyes narrowed. "And the bell? Why wasn't it on the desk when you first entered the study this morning? You say it was there when you found Lord Hargrove, but why wasn't it there when you came earlier?" Samuel's face paled, and his gaze dropped to the floor. His silence spoke volumes. "Tell me the truth, Samuel," Fraser pressed, her voice sharp. "Now, what really happened last night?" The butler took a deep, shaky breath before speaking in a low, almost inaudible voice. I heard him talking, to himself, I mean, but there was something strange. I went in briefly, just to check on him, and I saw the bell on his desk. But he wasn't the one who placed it there. It wasn't his hand that set it down. Fraser's heart skipped a beat. Who placed it there? Samuel. Samuel's eyes flickered with panic, but he said nothing. Fraser's gaze hardened. Who placed it there? She demanded. The butler looked up, finally meeting her eyes. It wasn't me, ma'am, and it wasn't Lord Hargrove either. It was Mrs. Hargrove. Fraser felt a chill sweep through her. Jane Hargrove had been in the study the night before her husband's death, and she had placed the bell on the desk, the very same bell that had failed to ring, the bell that had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. The pieces were falling into place, and yet the puzzle still wasn't complete. If Jane had placed the bell there, what was her role in this, and what had really happened in the moments before Lord Hargrove's death? Fraser's mind was racing, but she knew one thing for certain. Jane Hargrove wasn't just a grieving wife. She was hiding something, and whatever that secret was, it was at the heart of this baffling case. Fraser turned to leave the study, her thoughts a whirlwind of suspicion and unanswered questions. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Fraser moved swiftly through the corridors of the Hargrove estate, her mind working in overdrive. The atmosphere of the mansion felt heavier now, the air thick with secrets and contradictions. There were too many questions, too many tangled motives, and no clear answers. Every suspect had a reason to be involved: greed, jealousy, revenge, fear, but each theory seemed to leave something crucial unexplained. She stopped for a moment in the dimly lit hallway outside the drawing room, her thoughts spiraling. Jane Hargrove's involvement seemed undeniable now. She had been in the study the night before Lord Hargrove's death, the one who had placed the bell on his desk. But the question remained, what was her motive? Could she have orchestrated the death to gain her husband's fortune, or was there something more personal at play? Her next step was clear. Jane. Fraser needed to see her again, to probe deeper into the woman's emotions and actions. But before she could make her way to the drawing room, a soft, almost hesitant voice stopped her. Detective. Fraser turned to find Philip Hargrove standing at the far end of the hall, his face drawn with worry. He was holding something, a small envelope, the edges crisp and neat. His expression suggested he had been deliberating over something before approaching her. "I've been thinking about what I told you earlier," he said, his voice unsteady. I don't think I've told you everything. I might be able to help." Fraser eyed him carefully. She had already noted the nervous energy he carried, the way he seemed to hide something behind his youthful features, the kind of unease she had seen in too many guilty parties. "What's this about, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, her tone neutral. Philip glanced around the hallway as though making sure no one was watching. "It's about the conversation I overheard. There's more to it. A few hours before I heard my uncle's voice on the phone. He was acting strange, very strange. He was speaking with someone else's lawyer, I believe. I don't know for sure, but there was mention of changing the will." Fraser felt a flicker of realization. A change in the will, that could explain a motive, at least partially. Philip's words added a new layer to the mystery, one that involved potential inheritance and legal battles. "A change in the will," she repeated. Her interest piqued. What exactly was discussed? Philip looked away, biting his lip. "I don't know the details. I only heard bits and pieces. But there was mention of an addition to the terms, something about revoking certain assets. And I overheard my uncle say something like, 'If I'm not careful, they'll come for everything.'" The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lord Hargrove had been preparing for something, anticipating that people close to him might try to strip him of his wealth. But who and why? Fraser leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm and controlled. "Was your uncle referring to anyone specifically? Who was he worried about?" Philip hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the envelope. I don't know. He didn't mention names, but I suspect it had something to do with my aunt, Jane. She wasn't happy with him, and he knew it." Fraser's mind raced. Jane Hargrove had been unhappy with Lord Hargrove's eccentricities, his obsessions, his control over their lives. A change in the will could very well have been the breaking point. But was it enough to push her to murder before she could ask more questions? The door to the drawing room opened, and Jane herself appeared. Her face was pale, eyes tired, as though the weight of the situation had taken its toll. She looked at Philip for a moment, then turned her gaze to the detective. "I see you've been having more discussions with my nephew," Jane said, her voice tight but controlled. "Have you found anything of use?" Fraser studied her closely. The earlier nervousness that Jane had shown seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a cold, composed demeanor, but beneath it, Fraser could see the faintest tremor. In her hands, Jane was hiding something. She was calculating. "I was just speaking with Mr. Hargrove about his uncle's concerns," Fraser replied, her tone neutral. "It seems your husband was worried about something involving his assets." Jane's expression flickered, but she quickly masked it with a faint smile. "Clarence always worried about his wealth. It was his obsession. But I assure you, Detective, I had no part in it." Fraser's eyes locked with hers. "I'm sure you didn't. But what about the will? Was there a change in it? Did Lord Hargrove make any alterations recently?" Jane's posture stiffened. The subtle shift in her demeanor was enough to confirm that something was amiss. "I don't know what you're implying, Detective," she said, her voice rising ever so slightly. "Clarence was a proud man, but he never discussed anything like that with me. Whatever he did, it was between him and his lawyer." Fraser studied her face, noting the tightness around her mouth and the slight flush of color creeping into her cheeks. Jane was lying. It wasn't a matter of suspicion anymore. It was an undeniable fact. "You were in the study the night before his death, Mrs. Hargrove," Fraser said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You placed the bell on the desk. That bell was meant to signal something, wasn't it? Perhaps a moment of finality. What did you know about your husband's plans?" Jane's eyes darkened, her expression shifting from controlled indifference to something colder, more calculating. "My husband had his strange notions, but this is absurd. You're grasping at straws." Fraser leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm not grasping at straws, Mrs. Hargrove. I'm unraveling a web of lies. You and your nephew have motives. Both of you stand to inherit. But so do the servants. And what about Samuel? He's hiding something, too, isn't he?" Jane flinched, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stepped back, the mask of composure slipping. "What are you suggesting, Detective? That I killed my husband for money? That I know?" Fraser interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "I'm suggesting that your marriage wasn't just about love or loyalty. It was about control, about power. And if your husband was planning to revoke his assets, you would have been left with nothing." Jane's eyes shifted again, the cold calculation returning. But this time, there was something else there, a flicker of fear. Fear that Fraser had hit the nail on the head. Jane Hargrove had been planning something, but now it seemed her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. Fraser stood still, allowing the silence to stretch between them, before speaking again. "But you didn't act alone, did you? Someone helped you. Someone who stands to gain from your husband's death as much as you do, maybe even more." Jane's face drained of color, her eyes darting toward the door as though seeking a way out. The realization hit Fraser with a shock. This was no simple crime of passion. This was calculated. A web of deceit, greed, and fear spun by people who had far more at stake than the obvious suspects. The only question left was, who else was involved in this intricate scheme? And how far were they willing to go to keep their secret safe? Fraser's mind was clearer now, but the final pieces of the puzzle remained elusive. It was time to confront the rest of the household, every single person, every tiny thread in this web, to bring the full truth to light. The next morning, the estate was alive with an unusual sense of urgency. Word had spread that an important breakthrough had been made in the investigation into Lord Hargrove's death. The authorities, after reviewing the evidence in greater detail, had uncovered what they believed to be a crucial piece of the puzzle, a ledger hidden in the late Lord's private study, containing entries that pointed directly to Mrs. Hargrove's involvement in the affair. The papers revealed a series of transactions, cryptic notes about her financial dealings, and some startling references to a secret offshore account in her name. Fraser stood at the periphery, watching as officers carried the ledger from the study, their faces lit with the thrill of the discovery. There was a flurry of excitement among the local police, each person eager to share their own interpretations of the new evidence. They were ready to close the case, to pronounce it solved. But Fraser wasn't so sure. She stood there for a moment, watching the celebration unfold, then glanced at the Hargrove family. Philip was at the center of the room, talking animatedly with the inspector, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Jane, on the other hand, was unusually quiet. Her face was an impassive mask, betraying no hint of emotion as she watched the scene unfold. The detective's instincts tugged at her. Everything about this felt too clean, too easy. The evidence was solid. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it was all too convenient, too neatly tied together. The pieces were falling into place. Yes, but there was still something, just out of reach, something that didn't sit right. Detective Fraser. A voice called from behind her, snapping her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Samuel, the butler, approaching with an anxious look on his face. I have something to tell you, something you should know before the authorities get ahead of themselves. Fraser arched an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. She had spoken with Samuel before, but now he seemed almost frantic. His hands were wringing together, and there was an edge of desperation in his voice. What is it, Samuel? He lowered his voice, glancing nervously toward the group gathered around the ledger. It's about the ledger. There's something you should know. That ledger, it's not what they think. I was in the study last night, after the police left. I found something else. Fraser's heart skipped a beat. What did you find? Samuel hesitated again, clearly conflicted. But after a long, tense moment, he finally spoke. I found another ledger, a second one, hidden behind the bookshelves. It was far more recent, just a few weeks old, and it wasn't just about finances. It had names of people who had been in contact with Lord Hargrove. People who aren't in the family. Not even close. Fraser's pulse quickened. This was the break she had been waiting for. But something about Samuel's urgency set off another alarm in her mind. He was too eager to share this information, almost as if he were trying to steer her in a particular direction. What names? Fraser asked sharply, her tone more insistent now. Samuel swallowed hard, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. I didn't read all of it, Detective, but I saw one name, someone who had been in frequent contact with Lord Hargrove, his lawyer, a man named Charles Meredith. He's not just a lawyer. There were notes, very private notes. Lord Hargrove was worried about him, about something he had done. Fraser felt a flicker of excitement. Charles Meredith, a lawyer tied to both the will and Lord Hargrove's final days? This was the lead that could change everything. Where is this ledger now? She asked, her voice low. It's hidden, ma'am, Samuel said, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't move it, but I was going to tell the authorities. But then I saw the officers were already so excited about the other ledger. I didn't want to disrupt things. But this other ledger is important, I swear. Fraser's mind raced. Charles Meredith had to be connected to this somehow. His name had come up too often. And now, this second ledger, hidden away for so long, was the one that had the answers. If it contained evidence that Lord Hargrove had been worried about him, then Meredith could very well be the key to unraveling the mystery. She nodded sharply. You've done the right thing, Samuel. I'll need you to show me where it is. And don't tell anyone else about it. Do you understand? He nodded eagerly. Yes, ma'am. I'll show you. But before he could finish his sentence, a loud voice interrupted the conversation. Detective Fraser, a word, please. It was the inspector, looking thoroughly pleased with himself, holding the ledger that had been found earlier in the day. We've made our breakthrough, he said with a grin, practically beaming. It's all coming together. Jane Hargrove is the one we need to focus on. Fraser's stomach churned at the sight of the ledger in the inspector's hands. The pieces were indeed coming together, but something about the scene felt off. The authorities had rushed to make an arrest, but they hadn't even considered the possibility of a deeper conspiracy. The ledger, the second ledger, it all pointed to a more complicated narrative than they were willing to admit. I need to review that ledger, Fraser said, her voice controlled but firm. Before you jump to any conclusions, I must make sure we're not missing something critical. The inspector's smile faltered. but he quickly masked it with a forced professionalism. "Of course, detective, but we've already made our assessment. Mrs. Hargrove has the most to gain. She's the key to this entire mess." Fraser felt a surge of frustration. The authorities were too eager to wrap things up. They had their suspect, their evidence, and now they wanted to declare victory. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the real criminal, the one who had been pulling the strings, was still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I will need some time with the ledger," Fraser insisted, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not convinced that Mrs. Hargrove is the only one involved. There's more to this than meets the eye." The inspector gave her a curt nod, though his expression said he disagreed. "Very well, but we're moving forward with the arrest." As the inspector turned to leave, Fraser caught a glimpse of Jane standing in the doorway of the drawing room, her face unreadable, her eyes like mirrors reflecting nothing but cold indifference. She was waiting for something, waiting for the investigation to unfold in the way she had hoped, for the authorities to make their move and seal her fate. But Fraser wasn't ready to make that leap. There was something deeper, something darker, lurking beneath the surface, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. "Samuel," she said, turning back to the butler, "take me to the second ledger." "Now." He nodded quickly, his relief palpable. Together they moved toward the study, but the tension between them had grown thicker. It was clear that Samuel was more than just a witness. He was involved in this web of deception, and the closer they got to the truth, the more he seemed like a man who had already chosen his side. Fraser had no illusions that the ledger would be the answer. But it was a start, and as she opened the hidden compartment behind the bookshelves, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true mastermind was closer than ever, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had already made his next move. The study door creaked shut behind Fraser, the soft sound of wood against frame almost drowned out by the buzzing tension that filled the room. Samuel led the way, his every step cautious, as though walking on fragile ground. His fingers brushed the bookshelves as he reached the hidden compartment, his hand lingering just for a moment before he opened it, revealing the second ledger. It was old, older than the first one found earlier, its leather-bound cover cracked with age. The pages inside were yellowed, and the ink, though still legible, had faded in some places. But it wasn't the age of the ledger that caught Fraser's attention. It was the weight of it, the way it felt as though the past was staring back at her. With each turn of the page, Samuel shifted uneasily beside her as she flipped through the entries. At first glance, there were no shocking revelations, just a long list of names, dates, and figures. But then she came across something that made her stop. A name she had heard before, but one that had never fully registered until now. Charles Meredith. Meredith had been mentioned in both ledgers, and while his name had come up before, it was now connected to something far more troubling. Fraser traced the ink with her fingertip, her thoughts racing. The first ledger had pointed to Mrs. Hargrove, but this second one seemed to confirm something darker, something deeper. She turned to Samuel, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't mention Charles Meredith was involved in this ledger," she said, her voice calm but forceful. "Why?" Samuel hesitated, his face shifting from nervous to almost frightened. "I didn't know what it meant. I wasn't sure if it was important. I thought it was just old business, my lord's affairs, but there were names, and some of them weren't in the family at all." Fraser's fingers hovered over the page as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about Lord Hargrove's death, it was about something older, something that had been festering for years. Her mind sifted through the connections, looking for the thread that would tie it all together. And then it came to her. The name wasn't just a random entry, it was a thread that linked Charles Meredith to a case she had never fully explored. Fraser glanced at Samuel, her mind flicking to a time years before, a case long buried beneath the weight of other investigations. She hadn't realized it then, but now the connection seemed clear. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady, "did you know that Charles Meredith was involved in a case several years ago? A case that involved another family in this area. The Larkins?" Samuel looked up, his brow furrowing. "The Larkins? I don't know. I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about them." Fraser's mind sharpened, the memory of the old case surfacing with startling clarity. The Larkin family had been embroiled in a scandal involving financial fraud, accusations of embezzlement, and the sudden disappearance of the family patriarch. But the case had been dropped just as quickly as it had begun. There had been no concrete evidence, just whispers of corruption that had never been proven. But now, that case seemed more relevant than ever. She moved away from the ledger, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, the estate sprawled in all its grandeur, the peaceful scene belying the tension that gripped the household. She could feel the weight of the past in the air, the faint echoes of something that had been buried, something that was now rising to the surface. Fraser turned back to Samuel, her mind racing with the connections. Charles Meredith wasn't just a lawyer for the Hargroves, she said softly. He was also involved with the Larkins. In fact, he had a history with them, especially with their missing patriarch, David Larkin. Samuel's face paled, and he took a step back, his eyes widening. What are you saying, Detective? That Meredith was connected to a scandal that should have been investigated years ago. Fraser finished for him, but he covered it up. And now, it seems that his dealings with Lord Hargrove have led to something far darker. I believe that Lord Hargrove knew about Meredith's past, and he had a reason to confront him. The realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap. The case wasn't just about money, about inheritance, it was about revenge. Lord Hargrove had uncovered something from the past, something tied to Meredith's role in the Larkin scandal, and he had planned to use it. The ledger was proof of that. Lord Hargrove had been documenting everything, preparing for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Fraser demanded, her voice hardening. This changes everything. This isn't just a case of greed or betrayal, it's about retribution. Hargrove was killed because he knew something, because he was about to expose the truth. Samuel swallowed hard, his face twitching with nerves. I didn't think it was important. My lord, he was obsessed with his clocks and time. I thought it was just one of his eccentricities. But now I see. Fraser turned away from him, her mind spinning as she pieced together the tangled web. Meredith's involvement with the Larkins, his manipulation of the Hargroves, it all pointed to one thing, a long-standing grudge, one that had festered for years. And now it had come to a head. The silence in the study was deafening. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the weight of the past and present pressing down on her all at once. She had thought the case was just about the Hargrove family, their wealth and their power. But now it was clear that this was bigger, much bigger. Meredith was at the center of it all, a man with a past he was desperate to keep buried. Fraser felt a sharp pang of certainty. The truth was close to close, in fact, and it wasn't just about solving Lord Hargrove's murder anymore. It was about uncovering a decades-old conspiracy, one that had been carefully hidden beneath the layers of family secrets and betrayal. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was one thing that bothered Fraser: the way the investigation had unfolded. Everything had seemed too easy, too neat. The authorities had been too quick to point fingers at Jane Hargrove. The ledger had provided the perfect scapegoat. But what if the case was more complicated than they realized? What if the true criminal had been hiding in plain sight all along? She turned back to Samuel, her mind racing. "Get me Charles Meredith," she said, her voice resolute. "Now, we need to confront him about the Larkins, about his involvement in this case. It's time to bring everything to light." Samuel nodded quickly, though his face still held traces of fear. He knew that once Meredith was brought into the fold, there would be no turning back. The walls had already started to crumble, and soon, the full extent of the deception would be exposed. Fraser's gaze swept over the study once more, her thoughts turning over everything she had learned. The case had roots buried deep in the past, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows of that past caught up with the present. The truth was coming, piece by piece, and it was darker and more dangerous than anything she had imagined. Fraser stood by the fireplace, her mind racing as she mulled over the new revelations. The second ledger, Charles Meredith's connection to the Larkins, the buried family secrets, all of it seemed to point to a larger, more intricate conspiracy than anyone had anticipated. But the one piece that was still elusive was Meredith himself. She needed to draw him out, to get him to reveal the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. She had already seen how Jane Hargrove reacted under pressure, cold, composed almost, to perfect in her efforts to maintain control. But Meredith was a different breed. He was clever, manipulative, and had spent years covering up his darker dealings. Fraser needed something unconventional, something unexpected, to catch him off guard. Something that would force him to reveal the truth. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece where the intricate, antique clock sat, one of Lord Hargrove's prized possessions. The same clock that had been broken when she first arrived at the estate. It had been repaired, of course, but now, in the quiet of the study, Fraser had an idea. The clock was more than just a timepiece. It was a symbol of Lord Hargrove's obsession with time, a symbol of control. The meticulous winding of its gears mirrored his need to control every aspect of his life, down to the smallest detail. And it was that very control that had led to his death. But what if the clock, with all its symbolism, could be more than just a motif? What if it could be used as a psychological tool to push Meredith into revealing something he didn't want? Fraser turned to Samuel, who had been standing by, waiting for her instructions. "I need you to bring Charles Meredith to the study," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Tell him that I want to discuss the will, and that we've uncovered some new details. But don't mention the ledger. Just bring him here." Samuel nodded without hesitation, and within moments, he was gone, leaving Fraser alone with her thoughts. The clock ticked steadily, its sound almost deafening in the silence of the room. She watched it for a moment, letting the rhythm of the ticking settle her nerves. When Meredith arrived, he was exactly as she expected, smooth, composed, and entirely confident in his ability to handle whatever Fraser threw his way. He stepped into the study, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on her. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a hint of calculation, of readiness. "Detective," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of polite disdain. "I assume this is about the will." Fraser nodded slowly, studying him. "Yes, Mr. Meredith. We've uncovered something new, something that could change everything. But before we discuss it, I want to ask you about the clock." Meredith's eyebrows arched in surprise, though he quickly masked his reaction. "The clock?" he repeated, his tone dismissive. "It's a mere trinket. I don't see how that's relevant." Fraser didn't flinch. "You see, Lord Hargrove was very particular about his clocks. He took great care in maintaining them, winding them at precisely the right moment, ensuring that every gear turned perfectly in sync. It's almost as if he believed that by controlling time in such a meticulous manner, he could control his own fate. But what if he didn't just control time, Mr. Meredith? What if he believed that time controlled him?" Meredith's lips tightened, but he didn't speak. Fraser could see the subtle shift in his expression, a small crack in his composure. He was listening, and that was all she needed. "You see," she continued, stepping closer to the clock, "Lord Hargrove had a particular obsession with the idea of time running out. He was a man obsessed with control, and this clock was his symbol. But what if it wasn't just about keeping time? What if he believed that the ticking of the clock was a reminder that something or someone was closing in on him, that his time was running out?" She let the words hang in the air, watching Meredith's reaction carefully. His face had hardened slightly, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a subtle shift, a tiny crack in his otherwise perfect facade. He took a step forward, his gaze following hers as she circled the clock. "You're trying to tell me that the clock is somehow connected to his death?" Meredith asked, his voice laced with incredulity. "That's a stretch, detective." Fraser didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out and gave the clock's pendulum a gentle push, setting it swinging. The ticking filled the room, steady and rhythmic, as if mocking the very idea of time running out. Meredith's eyes flickered toward the clock, and Fraser saw his grip tighten on the edge of the table. He was trying to maintain his composure, but there was an edge of nervousness creeping in. She could feel the shift in the air. He was growing uncomfortable. "You're a man who understands control, Mr. Meredith," she said, her voice low but deliberate. "And you know that time is something you can't control. It's something that always catches up with you, whether you're ready for it or not. The question is, how far would you go to avoid facing your own past? How far would you go to prevent the truth from coming to light? Meredith took a step back, his face paling ever so slightly. I don't know what you're implying, detective, but this is absurd. If you think that a clock could somehow provide an answer to this, Fraser interrupted him, her tone cutting through his words. You knew about Lord Hargreaves' plans to expose you, didn't you? You knew he was going to bring up the Larkin case again, your involvement in that scandal. You knew he had found the evidence, and you knew he was going to use it to ruin you. And you couldn't let that happen. You couldn't let your carefully constructed life fall apart. For a moment, Meredith didn't move. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that instant, Fraser could see the panic rising in him. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He had been pushing everything to the brink for years, maintaining his grip on power, on control. But now, the cracks were starting to show. You're wrong, he said, his voice steady. Too controlled, you don't know what you're talking about. But the way his eyes darted toward the door, the way his hand gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly, Fraser knew the truth. He was lying. The guilt was written all over him, despite his attempts to mask it. He had been exposed, and the clock had done its job. Fraser took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's too late, Mr. Meredith. The clock is ticking, and you've run out of time. For a long moment, Meredith didn't speak. He stood frozen, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. The game was up. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging in defeat. You're right, he muttered. I did it. I couldn't let him ruin me. I couldn't let him expose everything I've worked so hard to build. Fraser watched him carefully, her mind still working through the implications of his confession. The clock had done its job. But now the real work began, unraveling the depths of Meredith's involvement and tying him to the death of Lord Hargrove. As Meredith's shoulders slumped, a sense of finality settled over the room. The case wasn't just about greed, about control, it was about survival. And in the end, survival had led someone to murder. The confession had been the breakthrough Fraser had needed. Charles Meredith, his carefully crafted walls crumbling, had finally admitted to his role in Lord Hargreaves' death. But even as Meredith spoke, Fraser could feel the atmosphere shift. The air had grown thick, suffocating with tension, as if something was moving in the shadows, something she hadn't yet seen. The room seemed to close in around her as she processed the details of Meredith's confession. He had killed Lord Hargrove to protect his own secrets tied to a scandal long buried, a past he couldn't afford to revisit. But as Fraser's mind raced, she couldn't shake the sense that something was off. There were still gaps in the story, things Meredith wasn't telling her, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized that this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. Fraser turned her attention back to Meredith, who now sat slumped in a chair, his hands trembling as he spoke of his motive. I didn't mean to kill him, he muttered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. He was going to expose everything, detective. I had no choice. Fraser leaned forward, studying him. His admission was damning, but she couldn't let him off the hook just yet. What exactly was he going to expose? Meredith, you've confessed to the murder, but you still haven't explained everything. Meredith's eyes darted nervously, his breathing shallow. I thought he was going to ruin me. I thought he'd tell everyone about the Larkin case, about how I helped cover up David Larkin's disappearance. But it wasn't just that, detective. It was everything. Lord Hargrove knew too much. He was going to ruin me, and I couldn't let that happen. Fraser studied him carefully, every word, sinking deeper into the puzzle. She had known there was more to this case than a simple act of passion or greed. But as Meredith spoke, another question formed in her mind. Who else knew about these dark secrets? Who else was involved in the conspiracy to keep Lord Hargrove quiet? Before she could press him further, a sharp, sudden sound interrupted her. Thoughts a crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating quickly down the hallway. Fraser's heart raced as she bolted from her chair, her instinct screaming that something had just gone terribly wrong. Stay here, she snapped at Meredith, her voice low and urgent. She didn't wait for a response. The game had just changed. She rushed out of the study, her shoes pounding against the marble floors of the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of servants and staff absent. But there was something else, something far more unsettling, the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was just out of sight, waiting for her to make a move. Fraser rounded the corner into the library and froze. The sight before her took her breath away. The ledger, the very one that had brought Meredith to the breaking point. It was sitting on the desk, but the pages were now scattered, torn, and partially burned, smudged black ink and ash marking the edges of the remaining fragments. She felt a cold wave of fury wash over her, the blood pounding in her ears. The evidence had been tampered with, destroyed in an attempt to erase the truth. Before it could be fully revealed, Fraser's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of who had done this. But the room was still, the air thick with the sense of something lost, something stolen. A voice behind her made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. "Detective!" She spun to find Samuel standing at the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know what happened," he stammered. "I just came in to check on the study, and I found it like this." The ledger. Fraser cut him off with a sharp gesture, her gaze still locked on the destroyed pages. "Someone stole the evidence," she said through gritted teeth. "Someone is trying to bury the truth." Samuel's hands wrung together, his eyes darting nervously. "I swear I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But I've been downstairs for the past hour, making sure the guests were comfortable. I don't know who could have." Fraser's mind raced, the pieces clicking together. The destruction of the ledger, the broken fragments strewn across the desk. It wasn't random. Someone knew what was at stake. Someone who was desperate to stop her from finding the truth. "Stay here," Fraser ordered, her voice firm but laced with urgency. "I need to find out who did this." She left the library, moving quickly through the house, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The thought that someone inside the estate was working against her made her blood run cold. But who would be desperate enough to destroy the one piece of evidence that could bring the whole case to a head? Fraser's thoughts spun with possibilities. Every servant, every member of the Hargrove family, even the guests who had arrived just days before. Anyone could be involved. But as she moved through the hallways, one name lingered in her mind: Jane Hargrove. She had been the first suspect, and now, with the ledger destroyed, it seemed as though she had the most to lose. But there were others. Samuel's nervousness had been palpable, and his reluctance to explain his whereabouts was suspicious. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she approached the staircase leading to the upper floors. The silence of the house felt oppressive now. Something had shifted, and the stakes had never been higher. She had to act quickly before the evidence disappeared entirely. Fraser reached the second floor and made her way to the study, where Jane had been earlier, but the room was empty. The window was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light creeping through. As Fraser stepped inside, she noticed something strange. On the desk sat a single piece of paper, an old receipt that looked out of place. She picked it up, examining it closely. The handwriting was familiar. It was Lord Hargrove's. The receipt, dated 3 days before his death, was for a large sum of money, transferred to an unknown account. The name written on the bottom was Charles Meredith's, but there was more beneath. The name, in small, hurried script, were the words, "The past is a dangerous thing." Fraser's heart pounded. The receipt was more than just a financial transaction. It was a warning. Lord Hargrove had known what was at stake. He had known the danger he was in, and now, it seemed, someone was desperate to cover their tracks. Fraser's thoughts flew in all directions. She was on the verge of uncovering something monumental, but now, with the evidence gone, the case had become a race against time. Someone was working against her, but who? And what was the final piece that could unlock the mystery? She slipped the receipt into her pocket, her resolve hardening. The game had just become more dangerous, and the people she thought she could trust were starting to slip through her fingers. But she wouldn't stop. Not until the truth was out. Not until Lord Hargrove's murderer was unmasked, no matter how deep the conspiracy ran. Fraser stepped carefully down the hallway, her fingers tightening around the receipt she had just found in Jane. Hargrave's study. The words scrawled on the back haunted her. The past is a dangerous thing. She had suspected that Lord Hargrave's death wasn't just a random act of violence, but now, with this cryptic note, she was certain that he had known more than he had let on. He had been afraid, and not of just the immediate danger, but of something much older, something buried deep in the shadows of this house. Her thoughts swirled, trying to piece together the fragmented clues. But as she rounded the corner, the sound of hurried footsteps brought her back to the present. A scream pierced the otherwise silent house, sharp and guttural. Fraser's heart jumped in her chest. She didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the sound, every instinct telling her to get to the source before it was too late. The scream had come from the direction of the garden where the family had often gathered. In the late afternoon, as she reached the open door leading to the courtyard, she saw a figure crumpled at the foot of the stone steps. It was Samuel, the butler. His face was pale, his hands clutching at his throat. Gasping for breath, Fraser moved quickly, kneeling. Beside him, Samuel. What happened? Who did this? His eyes were wide with panic, and it took several moments for him to gasp out a response. It wasn't supposed to happen. They got to him, detective, they got to him before he could talk. Who, Samuel? Who did this? Fraser pressed, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She could feel the tension in the air, the quiet before the storm. Samuel's eyes fluttered, and he trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. He tried to hand it to her but collapsed in the process, his breath faltering as he exhaled a final, trembling gasp. Fraser grabbed the paper before he could let go, scanning the hastily written message. Don't go looking for what's buried. If you do, you'll be next. Her heart sank as she understood the threat. This wasn't just about Lord Hargrove anymore. It had become personal. Samuel had been the messenger, the unfortunate soul who had learned something dangerous to keep. His death was the latest sign that someone, somewhere in this house, had gone to great lengths to stop the truth from coming out. Fraser glanced down at the man's still form, her mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence, this was deliberate. Samuel had been targeted because of what he knew, or perhaps what he had been about to reveal. The silence of the garden seemed suffocating now, the weight of the moment pressing in on her. But she couldn't afford to waste time. Whoever had murdered Samuel had also ensured that the message would be delivered to her loud and clear. The stakes had escalated dramatically. Not only was she trying to solve Lord Hargrave's murder, but now she was up against someone who would stop at nothing to prevent her from uncovering the truth. With one last look at Samuel's lifeless body, Fraser turned and made her way back toward the house. She couldn't trust anyone now, not even the people who had been closest to Lord Hargrove. It was clear that she was dealing with someone who was always a step ahead of her, someone who had anticipated her every move and had played their hand expertly. Her thoughts turned back to Jane. The name lingered in her mind as she moved swiftly toward the study. She had always considered Jane to be a quiet, calculating presence. But after the destruction of the ledger, the cryptic message, and now Samuel's death, Fraser couldn't ignore the possibility that Jane was more involved in this conspiracy than anyone had originally suspected. She needed to see her. The study door was ajar when Fraser arrived, and as she entered, she found Jane sitting by the window, staring out at the garden, her posture rigid. She didn't turn when Fraser entered, but the stillness in her back was enough to signal that Jane was well aware of what had just happened. Fraser didn't wait for pleasantries. Samuel is dead, she said, her voice harsh. Whoever is behind this is still playing the game, and they just killed him to send a message. Jane's eyes flickered for a moment, but she quickly masked the reaction. What message? She asked, her voice cold, almost bored. The message that anyone who stands in their way will suffer the same fate, Fraser replied, stepping closer to Jane. And now it's your turn to explain yourself. Jane's gaze shifted slightly, but her face remained calm. Explain myself. I don't know what you're implying. I had nothing to do with Samuel's death. I've been sitting here, waiting for you to come back with the answers. Fraser's mind raced. Jane's cool detachment wasn't what she had expected. The woman had always been too composed, too controlled, but now there was something in her manner that suggested a deeper level of involvement than she had let on. It was that same calculated calm that seemed almost rehearsed, as if she were waiting for Fraser to make the wrong move. "Really?" Fraser asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "You expect me to believe that? Samuel was murdered just outside, and you've been waiting here, or perhaps you're waiting for someone else to make the next move." At the mention of someone else, Jane finally turned her head, her gaze locking with Fraser's. There was a flicker of something, fear, guilt, or was it just the tension of the situation creeping through the cracks? "I don't know who's behind this," Jane said softly, "but it's not just about the money. It never was. There are things that have been hidden for years. The family, the estate, they've always been at the center of it all." Fraser studied her carefully. "What do you mean? What things? What are you talking about?" But before Jane could answer, the distant sound of a phone ringing echoed through the study. It was the house phone, a harsh, ringing sound that seemed out of place in the growing tension. Jane's face went pale at the sound, and she stood abruptly. "I'll get it," she said quickly, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she reached for the receiver. Fraser stepped back, unsure of what to make of Jane's sudden reaction. As Jane lifted the phone to her ear, Fraser caught a glimpse of her expression, a strange, conflicted mix of fear and resolve. "Hello." Jane's voice was thin, almost imperceptible. Fraser's pulse quickened as she watched Jane's face twist in confusion and then fear. There was something in that brief exchange, something she had not expected. Jane's eyes darted toward her, and in that moment, the truth became painfully clear. Jane wasn't the only one who had been threatened. Someone else had just made a move, and now, it seemed, the very walls of this house were closing in on all of them. "We have to go," Jane said suddenly, her voice flat and strained. "Now, before they come for us." Fraser froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun as her mind raced through every possible scenario. Someone was still ahead of them, someone who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. And now, with Samuel's death and Jane's strange urgency, it was clear that the final act was just beginning. Fraser followed Jane out of the study, her every step measured, her senses finally attuned to the atmosphere that had shifted once again. The house no longer felt like a stately estate. It felt like a trap, quietly folding in on itself, secrets slipping through the cracks in the walls. Jane moved with a suddenness that unsettled Fraser. She had always been cool and self-contained, yet now there was an edge to her, a brittle urgency. Like someone barely keeping fear at bay. They moved through the side corridor toward the servants' wing, Jane's voice low. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. They said it would end with Meredith, that once he was gone, everything else would fall back into silence. But Samuel, he knew something." Fraser stopped her, seizing her arm gently but firmly. "You're going to explain all of this now, Jane. No riddles, no more. Who is pulling the strings? And what exactly did Samuel know?" Jane hesitated, eyes flicking toward the hallway shadows. "It's not just one person. You don't understand, detective, it's everyone. My husband, the estate solicitor, even the housekeeper at one point. This house, it's always been built on silence. Covering things up was just part of how we lived. Samuel, he kept records. He made copies. He knew where the real ledger was." Fraser's breath caught. "The real ledger, you're saying?" "The one that was destroyed wasn't the only one," Jane said. "Samuel had a copy. He told me after the inquest began, said he didn't trust what Meredith had done, that there were details being erased even before your arrival. He'd hidden it, not in the study, but somewhere he thought no one would look." Fraser's mind spun, reaching back over every moment since her arrival. Samuel had always been present, quiet, helpful, seemingly deferential, but never quite relaxed. She remembered the look on his face the first time they spoke alone, the way his gaze darted toward the grandfather clock in the main hall, when she asked about Lord Hargreaves' routines. Then it hit her, the clock. She turned abruptly, leaving Jane mid-sentence, and strode toward the grand hall, the echo of her boots ricocheting off the high ceilings. The clock stood as it always had, elegant, dignified, and proud. Fraser stepped close, letting her hands trace the smooth brass of its face. Lord Hargrove had been obsessed with time. And yet this particular clock had never matched the others. In the house, its ticking was slightly slower, off by less than a second, but enough to be noticeable at least to someone like Hargrove. She crouched beside it, inspecting the base. Her fingers ran along the edge until they caught on something, rough beneath the polish, a barely visible groove. She pressed, and with a soft mechanical click, a small panel popped open inside. Wrapped in brown oilcloth and tied with thin twine was a book, smaller than the original ledger, but unmistakably handwritten in the same tight, orderly script. Samuel's handwriting. She pulled it out and opened to the first page. Each entry was dated, organized, cross-referenced with times and initials. At first glance, it was nothing more than financial data, but as she flipped further, other notes began to appear. Mentions of arguments overheard, meetings held late at night, mentions of Larkin, Meredith, and cryptic notations. J.H. overheard. 12:15. Clock moved again. Hargrove pacing before call. Each entry built upon the last until one in particular stopped her cold. January 12th. Meredith received envelope from me, not Hargrove. Arrived early. Jane intercepted it. Fraser read it twice, then a third time. Not Hargrove. She scanned back through previous entries and saw the name again. Evelyn brought tea early today. Stayed longer than usual. Watches Jane. Evelyn, the maid. Quiet, polite, largely unremarkable in her presence, but now her name recurred with uncomfortable frequency in Samuel's notes. She had been close to Jane. She moved freely through the house. No one paid her much attention. And then another phrase. Letter destroyed before it could be read. Suspect Evelyn is not what she seems. Fraser stood abruptly, her mind blazing. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight the entire time. Evelyn had access to every room, every private corner of the house. She would have known about the real ledger. She could have overheard the argument between Hargrove and Meredith, perhaps even the contents of that envelope. And if she were the one truly orchestrating events behind the scenes, then Samuel's death was no coincidence. He had figured it out, and now Fraser had as well. She turned to Jane, who had followed her silently, and now stood at the foot of the stairs, watching Fraser with a haunted expression. Evelyn, Fraser said quietly. Where is she? Jane blinked. She said she wasn't feeling well and went to lie down over an hour ago. Fraser was already moving. Then she's either fled or she's waiting, and I need to find her before either of those becomes a problem. Jane hesitated, then said, almost as an afterthought, she has a habit. Evelyn, she walks the garden maze when she's nervous, especially at dusk. Fraser was already at the door before she finished. The garden maze was barely visible in the fading light, its hedges tall and wild with neglect. Fraser entered cautiously, hand near her coat's hidden holster. The paths twisted unpredictably, the hush of dusk settling like a blanket across the grounds. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out sharply and fell silent again. Then she saw her. Evelyn stood in the heart of the maze, perfectly still, her back turned to Fraser. She looked like a statue, her apron still tidy, her hands folded before her. Fraser approached slowly. You knew Samuel had the real ledger. Evelyn didn't turn. He wasn't supposed to keep it. He said he would. He said it was insurance, but then he got nervous, started writing things down. You weren't supposed to find it either. Why? Fraser asked, stepping closer. What did Lord Hargrove know? Evelyn finally turned. Her expression was flat, but her eyes were alive with something brittle and burning. He knew about my brother, about what they did to him, Meredith, Hargrove. Larkin's disappearance, it wasn't random. It was covered up by all of them. My brother worked for the Larkins. He disappeared the same week David Larkin did. They said it was coincidence, but it wasn't. Fraser's breath caught. I was just the maid. I cleaned their filth. I knew things, but I waited until they trusted me, until they turned on each other. Then I made sure they did. Fraser's mind reeled. You manipulated everything. No, I gave them the chance to reveal themselves, and they did. Meredith killed Hargrove. Jane lied to protect the estate. Samuel tried to profit. I just helped the truth surface. I burned nothing you didn't already miss. Fraser stared at her. And Samuel. Evelyn looked away, finally showing. A flicker of guilt. He was going to run. I couldn't let him. Not when it was finally all falling into place. The wind shifted, cold against Fraser's cheek. The pattern was clear now, the long game of a woman underestimated by all, who had waited in silence, gathering the shattered pieces of a buried past and laying them out, one by one, for judgment. Fraser took a slow step forward. It's over now. Evelyn didn't move. No, not until the truth is heard. And with that, she extended her hands empty, no weapon, no threat, just the truth, at last, laid bare. Fraser stood in the maze, her eyes fixed on Evelyn, whose face had softened into a mixture of resignation and satisfaction. It was clear now the web of deceit, manipulation, and murder had been tangled beyond what she had ever imagined. The truth, if she could call it that, had slowly unraveled, but Evelyn's final words had left her with an unsettling sense of unease. Why? Fraser's voice was low, almost pleading, but still sharp. Why go to all this trouble? What was it that drove you to murder, to destroy lives, just to uncover this truth? Evelyn's gaze dropped to the ground, her hands trembling slightly, the once unshakable composure now fraying at the edges. Truth? She echoed with a bitter laugh. It's never about the truth, detective. It's about the stories we choose to tell ourselves, the lies we tell ourselves until we start to believe them. Fraser's pulse quickened, the last pieces falling into place as Evelyn's eyes met hers once more, this time, not with defiance, but with a deep, almost anguished sincerity. You think I did this for money, for revenge, or even for justice? Evelyn continued. But it wasn't about any of those things. I did it because I had to. I did it because they left me no choice. Fraser took a cautious step closer, her mind racing. Who, Evelyn? Who left you no choice? Evelyn looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the decision to finally say the words that had been buried in her for years. It was them, the Larkins, the ones who disappeared my brother. Fraser's breath hitched. What do you mean? David Larkin, your brother. What did they do to him? Evelyn inhaled sharply, her eyes glistening with something far more painful than hatred. It was the raw, jagged edge of grief long suppressed, now spilling out. They killed him. They erased him from everything, his name, his work, his family. Just like they did with the rest of us. They erased our history, our legacy. Fraser blinked, trying to process the enormity of the confession. The past was coming into focus now, the missing pieces falling into place, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Evelyn's actions, her machinations, were no longer about greed or power. They were about something much more visceral, about a scar that had festered in the dark for years, one Evelyn had carried with her as a silent weapon. They erased him because of what he knew, Evelyn whispered, because he found out something that no one was supposed to know about the land, the estate. The Larkins weren't just innocent victims in all of this. They were involved. They knew what was happening, knew about the secrets being kept from the public, and they couldn't have David expose them, not when they were already into deep. Fraser's mind spun. What secrets? What was your brother uncovering? Evelyn's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing with bitterness. It wasn't just about the estate, detective. It was about power. Power that went back generations. The land. The people. My brother found out that the Hargroves weren't who they pretended to be. They weren't the noble, upstanding family they showed to the world. They were complicit in everything. Fraser felt the weight of her words as they settled around her. The Hargroves, the Larkins, Evelyn's brother, whose life had been so ruthlessly taken. The truth was no longer just a matter of family feuds or financial scandals. It was a matter of blood, of history, of legacies built on lies. Your brother discovered something bigger than any of us could have known. Evelyn continued. The Hargroves had been involved in shady dealings long before any of this started. They used the Larkins as scapegoats for their own mistakes, covered up their crimes, and made sure no one would ever look closely enough to see the truth. Fraser's mind raced, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. David Larkin knew about the land deals, didn't he? He knew about how the Hargroves had been involved in the theft of property, manipulation of titles, everything that was supposed to be a secret. That's why they had to get rid of him. And then, When Lord Hargrove got too close to the truth about your brother's disappearance, he had to go too. Evelyn nodded slowly, a flicker of sorrow in her eyes. Exactly. They couldn't let the truth come out. They couldn't let anyone find out what had happened to my brother. It would have destroyed everything, the estate, the family name, everything they had built. So they silenced him, and then they silenced me, too. They made sure I was nothing but a maid in their house, invisible. But I watched, I listened, and you waited, Fraser said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. You waited for the right moment to strike, for the moment when Meredith would slip, when Samuel would uncover what he wasn't supposed to know, for the moment when you could finally expose them all. Evelyn's lips trembled. I never wanted to kill anyone, but when you've spent years buried in silence, you'll do anything to make the world listen, even if it means playing their game, using their lies against them. Fraser took a step back, her mind whirring. The murders, the manipulation, the destruction of evidence. It was all about something far more personal than mere financial gain. It was about retribution, a twisted, desperate need to erase the past by destroying those who had built their empire. On the blood of others, you think the truth will set you free, Fraser said softly, her eyes narrowing. But the truth is a weapon, Evelyn, and it's only going to destroy you too. Evelyn's eyes flickered with something almost like regret, but it was fleeting. She had crossed too many lines to turn back now. I did what I had to do. I didn't just kill for revenge. I killed for justice. Justice for my brother, for the people who were erased from history, and for every one of them who never got a chance to speak their truth. Fraser felt a wave of disgust wash over her, mixed with something else, a creeping sense of admiration. Evelyn wasn't just a villain, wasn't just some woman bent on revenge for the sake of revenge. She was a victim of history, a product of the lies and manipulations that had been passed down through generations. She had chosen the only path she felt was left to her, a path of destruction, fueled by the knowledge that the past would never be allowed to rest. Fraser looked at Evelyn one last time, her mind made up. You'll never find peace, Evelyn. You've been hiding in the shadows for too long. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, a final, bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Maybe. But at least I'll die knowing I made them face what they'd done. With that, Fraser turned away, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the history that had shaped this tragedy. Evelyn had been right about one thing: the truth had set her free. But it hadn't set anyone else free, and in the end, it was only the guilty who would remain shackled by their past. The night was suffocating. The house, once a sprawling estate of refinement and power, now felt like a prison. Every corridor, every room, soaked with secrets. Fraser stood at the center of it all, her mind honed to a razor's edge. The pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. Every lie, every dark corner, every shadow of doubt had led her here, to this moment. Evelyn was cornered. She had thought she was untouchable, that her careful orchestration of events had granted her control over everything. But now, as the detective stood across from her in the darkened parlor, Fraser knew the end was near. The fire in the hearth crackled quietly, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through. With a knife, Jane Hargrove stood by the window, eyes downcast, her posture stiff. She had been silent since Fraser's confrontation with Evelyn, though the guilty look in her eyes betrayed her. I did it, Evelyn said, breaking the silence as she stood near the table, her hands clasped tightly together. I exposed them, just like I promised. All of them, every last one of them. Fraser didn't flinch, her gaze fixed on Evelyn as if the woman's words were nothing more than a casual observation. Yes, you did, but there's more to it than just exposing them, isn't there? This wasn't just about revenge, it was about control. The moment you knew about your brother, about the truth, you saw the game as something you could play. Evelyn's lips twitched into a thin smile, but it was devoid of humor. I am playing the game, detective, the only game that matters. The Hargroves and the Larkins, they were always in control, pulling the strings. I was nothing but a shadow to them, but not anymore. I've taken back what was always mine. Fraser's expression remained unchanged, her pulse steady. You thought you could control the past, Evelyn, but you've only made the present more dangerous. Your brothers, Death wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was a message, a warning. And you're still trying to send it. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Instead, she turned away briefly, taking in the room around her as if contemplating her next move. Fraser could feel the shift, the moment before the final confrontation, when everything would either crumble or finally break free. "You're right," Evelyn said slowly, her voice colder now. "It was never about exposing the estate or the lies. That was just the surface. The truth is far worse than you think. Lord Hargrove wasn't the only one to die because of what my brother uncovered. It's bigger than that, much bigger." Fraser's heart skipped a beat. This was at the last piece. She'd suspected there was more beneath the surface, something Evelyn wasn't revealing. But now it was clear. "What are you talking about?" "Your own investigation," Evelyn said with a sneer. "It was never going to be just about finding the killer. You've been walking right into it, haven't you? You, the great detective, thinking you're uncovering the truth, but you're just another part of the plan." Fraser's stomach twisted. "I don't understand." Evelyn's smile grew wider, more unsettling. "You think you've been in control this whole time, that you're the one who pulled the strings, but you're the one who's been played. You were never meant to find the real killer. You were meant to find your way here, to this room, where everything converges." The words hung in the air, like smoke, thick and heavy, choking the clarity from Fraser's thoughts. She felt the trap snapping shut around her. She had been a part of it all along. "You," Fraser began, but before she could finish, Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low and almost tender. "It's simple, really. You've been chasing ghosts this whole time. The murders, the lies, the destruction. It was all meant to get you here, to this very moment, to watch you figure it out, piece by piece, until you realize what's really been happening." Fraser's eyes flicked toward Jane, who remained by the window, her hands trembling. Evelyn turned her gaze to the woman as well, a flash of something like satisfaction crossing her face. "You see," Evelyn continued, "you weren't just solving a crime, detective. You were solving my crime. I needed someone to dig. I needed someone to put the pieces together, to lead them back to me. And you did that. You've been running around in circles, letting me manipulate your every move." Fraser's mind raced, trying to process the revelation. The investigation had been methodical, structured, based on logic and evidence. But now Evelyn's words threatened to unravel everything. "You wanted me to find the truth," Fraser said, her voice laced with disbelief. "You wanted me to see the connections between your brother and the estate." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, and now you're starting to understand. The Larkins weren't just victims, they were players, and so were the Hargroves. They wanted their secrets to stay buried, but I gave them a reason to come to the surface. And you gave me the perfect cover, a detective investigating a crime no one could solve." The weight of Evelyn's manipulation sank in. She had been the puppet master all along, orchestrating everything to lead to this very moment. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about justice. It was about control of the story, control of the investigation, control of Fraser herself. "You wanted to make sure the past was never forgotten," Fraser murmured, her eyes narrowing with understanding. "But you're not just trying to expose the Hargroves. You're trying to rewrite the past, to erase the ones who wronged you, to make sure they never win." Evelyn's smile grew more insistent, almost manic. "Exactly. I don't care if I'm remembered as a criminal. At least I'll be remembered. They can't say that. They can't ever erase me again." Fraser felt the weight of the moment. The danger was here. Evelyn's obsession had become something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. She had already killed for her brother, and now she would kill to keep the narrative in her hands. But Fraser wasn't done yet. She took a deep breath, her mind moving as fast as the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Evelyn was right about one thing: she had been playing right into her hands. But now, Fraser had something Evelyn hadn't counted on, the one detail Evelyn had overlooked. "You're forgetting something, Evelyn," Fraser said, her voice calm but tinged with determination. "You may think you've been controlling this whole investigation, but there's one thing you never accounted for me." In an instant, Fraser reached for her phone, sending the signal she had prepared long ago. The door behind her burst open, and officers flooded in, their hands ready. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, defiant to the last. "You think you've won. You think this is over." Fraser remained composed, her gaze steady. "It's over, Evelyn. The only thing left is for you to face the truth of your own making." As Evelyn's defiance faltered, the officers moved in to take her into custody. But Fraser couldn't shake the feeling that even in defeat, Evelyn had one final move up her sleeve. Still, for now, the trap was closed. The story was over. The truth, no matter how twisted, had been revealed at last. The officers had Evelyn in cuffs now, her face a mask of frustration and disbelief, as if she had never truly imagined this day would come. They led her toward the door, the weight of her own web finally pulling her down. Fraser stood still, her mind swirling, the satisfaction of solving the case almost within reach. Yet something tugged at her, something she couldn't quite place. The room had quieted, the tension that had crackled like static now dissipating. Jane, still standing by the window, hadn't moved since Fraser's trap had closed on Evelyn. Her face was pale, her gaze distant, but it wasn't just shock. It was something deeper, something unsettled. Fraser's eyes narrowed slightly, a thought brushing the edges of her mind. There was something off, something unfinished in this story. She felt it in her bones, a nagging, insistent sensation that refused to let go. As Evelyn was ushered out of the room, her eyes flashed to Jane for a fleeting second. It wasn't the look of a defeated woman, it was something else, something far more knowing. Fraser turned sharply, her instincts flaring. "Jane, I need to talk to you." Jane blinked, as if pulled from a trance, but her expression remained unreadable. She nodded slowly, stepping toward Fraser with a reluctant pace, her every movement tinged with hesitation. "Is everything all right?" Fraser asked, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. "You've been quiet since Evelyn was taken." Jane's gaze flicked over to the door where Evelyn had just exited, her lips pressed tightly together. I don't know if it is," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "There's something you need to understand, something I should have told you earlier." Fraser's heart skipped a beat, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. "What are you talking about, Jane?" Jane looked at her, her eyes suddenly filled with something like regret. "You don't know everything. Evelyn wasn't the only one. She wasn't even the mastermind." Fraser's mind froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the desk for support. "What do you mean? You're saying there's someone else?" Jane nodded, but her eyes didn't meet Fraser's. "I didn't want to say anything. I didn't know how to. But Evelyn wasn't working alone. She was being used." Fraser's thoughts scrambled, racing faster than her words could keep up. "Used? By whom? Who else is involved in this?" Jane swallowed hard, then finally looked at Fraser with a strange sort of resignation. It wasn't just her, detective. She thought she was in control, but she was being manipulated by someone much closer, much more dangerous. Fraser felt the ground beneath her shift. Who was it, Jane? At that moment, a soft sound echoed from the doorway, a quiet click. Both women turned in unison. Standing in the open doorway, half in shadow, was a figure Fraser had almost forgotten about in the chaos of the investigation. Larkin. David Larkin's younger brother, Samuel Larkin. Fraser's pulse quickened as the realization began to settle in. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "But you were dead." Evelyn said. Samuel Larkin stepped into the room, his face inscrutable. His appearance was startling, gaunt, pale, and somehow too calm for someone who had been assumed dead. His clothes were those of a man who had been hiding, a carefully curated look designed to disarm anyone who might question his presence. "You thought it was Evelyn," Samuel said, his voice flat, almost bored. "You were right, in a way. She was a part of it, but she wasn't the one pulling the strings." Fraser's mind reeled. "You faked your death," she breathed, staring at him as though he were some phantom from a nightmare. "You manipulated all of us, everyone." Samuel gave a small smile, a flicker of something dark crossing his features. "I didn't fake my death, detective. I was never dead. I had to disappear, but not in the way you think. After David's untimely disappearance, I knew that the people involved in his death would keep coming after me. It wasn't safe. So, I went underground. It was the only way to find the truth. Fraser's chest tightened. But why Evelyn? Why drag her into this? Samuel's expression darkened. Evelyn didn't need dragging. She was always going to be part of it. She's been waiting for this moment for years, ever since she found out what happened to her brother. But the truth was bigger than just Evelyn. She thought she had control over everything, that she was getting justice. What she didn't realize was that she was my pawn. Jane had gone pale. No, Samuel. You're lying, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. I said whatever you needed to hear, Jane. Samuel interrupted, his voice suddenly cold. But the truth is this. Evelyn was so consumed with revenge. She never saw that the real danger was me. I've been pulling the strings all along. Fraser felt the weight of his words hit her like a blow. It wasn't Evelyn who had orchestrated the chaos. It was Samuel all along, operating from the shadows, using everyone's desire for vengeance and justice as fuel for his own twisted game. He had used his sister as a distraction, manipulated the investigation, and made sure the real story was never revealed until it was too late. You wanted the Hargroves, Fraser said slowly, piecing it together. You wanted control of the estate, the land, the power. Samuel gave a small, almost pitying smile. Of course I did. It was mine, wasn't it? The family name, the legacy, it's always been mine. But Evelyn, she wanted to destroy it all. She wanted the Hargroves to pay for her brother's death. She thought that would bring her peace. And you wanted everything else, Fraser said, her voice low and steady. You played everyone, Jane, Evelyn, even me. You made us chase ghosts while you waited in the wings. Samuel's eyes glittered with a cold light. I waited for the perfect moment, detective. And now, here we are. You were clever to clever. You uncovered pieces, but never the full picture. For a long moment, the room was still. Fraser felt the walls of the world around her closing in. Samuel's plan had worked. His twisted scheme had manipulated every part of the investigation, every move they made, until finally he stood victorious. But there was one thing Samuel hadn't counted on Fraser. Her mind worked quickly, calculating, analyzing. She couldn't afford to let him win. Not now, not when the truth was so close. You've made one mistake, Samuel. His eyes flickered. And what's that? You thought you controlled the game, but you didn't. With a signal to her team, the door behind Samuel opened. Officers poured into the room, surrounding him before he could react. The shock on his face was almost childlike, as though he hadn't expected his own game to unravel so quickly. You underestimated me, Samuel, Fraser said, stepping forward with a calm she didn't quite feel. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your actions. As they placed him in cuffs, Samuel's expression twisted in anger, but there was a tinge of something else, something darker, more resigned. You can't stop it, detective, he muttered, his eyes narrowing with malicious satisfaction. You'll never stop it. Fraser gave him one last look, her voice steady. I already have. And with that, Samuel Larkin was taken away, his game finally over. But Fraser couldn't shake the feeling that, in the end, the past wasn't finished with them yet. The echoes of their mistakes would follow them long after the case was closed. The heavy door to the holding cell clicked shut behind Samuel with a finality that echoed through the sterile, dimly lit room. The officers moved back, standing guard as Fraser watched the man who had orchestrated so much pain, so much destruction. Samuel's face was still pale, his eyes full of a quiet fury that had been there since the first moment they locked eyes. Yet, despite the fury, there was a weariness in his expression now, like a predator who had been cornered, realizing too late that the game was over. But for Fraser, this wasn't over. The case, the investigation, the truth, none of it had been as clean as it seemed. Samuel might have been the mastermind, but the story didn't end with his capture. There was something about this case that lingered like a phantom, refusing to settle into neat, easy closure. She turned away from the cell, her mind still working. Jane, who had been silent for the last few moments, stood by the far corner of the room, her face hidden in shadow. She hadn't spoken since Samuel's confession. but the tension in her posture was palpable. Fraser had an odd feeling that there was something unsaid, something Jane had yet to share. Fraser approached her slowly, the echo of her footsteps in the empty hallway oddly muffled in the stillness of the moment. She stopped a few feet away from Jane, who refused to look her in the eye. "Jane," Fraser began, her voice softer than before, "you knew something, didn't you? You knew what was going on before any of us did." Jane flinched but said nothing. Fraser took another step forward, her eyes narrowing as the pieces clicked together in her mind. "You weren't just a bystander in all of this. You were part of the puzzle. I can see it now how you reacted when I first spoke to you, the way you never really tried to dig deeper. You knew Samuel was still alive. You knew everything." Jane finally turned to face Fraser, her eyes dark with regret. "I didn't want to get involved," she whispered, "but I couldn't sit by and let it all happen. Samuel, he was the one pulling the strings, but he needed me. He needed me to keep you distracted, to make sure you'd never connect the dots. I helped him. I kept feeding you the wrong information, steering you off course, but I never wanted it to go this far. I didn't expect it to get this deadly." Fraser's heart sank as she realized the depth of Jane's involvement. "And you thought you could control it. You thought you could protect him. You knew all along he was playing a game, but you didn't stop him." "I tried to stop him," Jane said quickly, her voice trembling. "I did, but I couldn't. Not when I saw what he was capable of. The lies, the manipulation, and when Evelyn started looking for answers, I thought maybe it was too late. She was right to dig. But when she found Samuel alive, I thought everything would fall apart. That's why I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be a part of it anymore, but I couldn't leave him." Fraser's gaze hardened, but there was an undercurrent of understanding beneath her stern exterior. And now, Jane looked at her, tears welling up in her eyes. "Now I want it to end. I want it all to end. But I don't know if it ever will, Detective. I don't know if any of us will ever be free of this." The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Fraser exhaled slowly, her mind processing the tangled emotions of the case. Jane had been a part of the charade. She had played her role in keeping the investigation off course, feeding false leads, providing alibis where there were none. But even as she had walked that line, there had been hesitation, guilt, the nagging feeling that she wasn't truly in control. But now it was done. Samuel was caught, and Jane, though complicit, would be seen as an accessory, perhaps more a victim of her own misguided loyalty than a mastermind in her own right. Fraser knew the law would deal with her accordingly, but it was the justice of the situation that unsettled her. There was still a rawness to this case that would not heal with a simple arrest, not when the deeper wounds, family ties, betrayals, years of manipulation ran so deep. The days following Samuel's arrest passed in a blur. Fraser returned to her office, the familiar quiet hum of the investigation room surrounding her as she pored over the case files. Despite Samuel's confession, the more she thought about it, the more she realized how many threads had been overlooked in the frenzy of it all. There were moments, small, seemingly insignificant details that now stood out to her, moments she had dismissed as unimportant at the time. The missing piece that had eluded her during the investigation was clearer now. The connection between Jane and Samuel had always been there, but she had been so focused on Evelyn's overt manipulations that she had missed the quieter, subtler influence of the Larkins. Jane hadn't been just an innocent bystander. She had been someone deeply entwined in the story, someone who had actively shaped the outcome, even if she hadn't fully understood what she was helping to create. And then there was the pattern, the faint, almost imperceptible pattern of Samuel's movements, the way he had managed to stay one step ahead, knowing exactly what they would uncover, always watching, always listening. He had always known where the investigation would lead, and he had ensured it followed the path he wanted. Fraser leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The truth had been pieced together, but the case had never truly been closed in her mind. Samuel had orchestrated the entire drama, but he wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. Jane, despite her remorse, had been a critical part of the deception, and Evelyn, though she had ultimately been a pawn in the game, had pushed things to a point of no return. But there was something more, something she wasn't ready to confront just yet. Fraser turned her attention back to the case file, eyes scanning over the final documents. Samuel had been caught, yes, but the trail wasn't as clean as they'd hoped. The depths of the deception were darker than even she had imagined. And now, with the game finally over, the question lingered in the air. Had justice truly been served? She picked up the phone, dialing a number she had been avoiding since the arrest. The line clicked, and the familiar voice of her superior filled her ear. "Fraser, I need to speak with you," Fraser said, her voice steady. "There's something about this case we missed, something that doesn't add up." The pause on the other end was heavy with unspoken questions. But Fraser didn't need to say more. The truth wasn't just about the killer. It was about everything that had been left unsaid, the things that had been swept under the rug. And if she didn't dig deeper now, it might slip away, buried beneath the lies. She wasn't done. "Not yet. Set up a meeting," Fraser said quietly. "We've got more work to do." The soft hum of the city outside her office window felt distant, almost foreign to Fraser as she sat in the dim light of her desk, the weight of the case still heavy on her mind. The arrest of Samuel Larkin had been a victory, and yet something was gnawing at her. There was an unease in the air like a door that had been half open, one she couldn't quite close. Fraser stood and paced the small space, her fingers brushing over the edges of the case file on her desk. The paperwork had been sorted, the final notes written, and everything appeared tied up neatly. As it should be, Samuel Larkin was behind bars. Justice, in theory, had been served. Yet, as the silence settled over her office, her thoughts kept circling back to that one lingering detail, the quiet little thread she hadn't been able to pull out completely. She picked up the phone, dialing her superior's number once again. The line clicked through, and soon the voice of Detective Inspector Reynolds filled the space between them. "Fraser, you sound like you're still working through something," Reynolds remarked, his tone casual, though Fraser could hear the underlying curiosity. "I am," Fraser said quietly, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm missing something small, a detail that doesn't fit with everything else." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a sigh. "What detail? We've covered everything. Larkin's behind bars. The case is closed." "I know," she replied, her voice firm, "but I keep thinking about how perfectly everything fell into place. Samuel's plan, how he stayed one step ahead, how he manipulated us all. It's almost too perfect. You think there's more?" Reynolds asked, his voice a bit more guarded now. Fraser didn't answer immediately. She was too busy turning the pieces over in her mind, the question twisting itself tighter in her chest. The more she thought about it, the more she realized Samuel had been too clean. His game had been flawless, but that didn't sit right with her. There was always a flaw in a perfect plan, always a gap, a crack. What if Larkin's real mistake wasn't in the plan itself? Fraser asked, her voice low and pensive. What if it was something else entirely? A message he didn't intend to send? Or maybe one he thought no one would ever understand? A pause stretched out. Reynolds's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "What do you mean?" Fraser closed her eyes, imagining the scene, the final confrontation with Samuel, the cold, emotionless way he had confessed, the way everything had seemed to fall into place too easily. The cryptic message Evelyn left behind. "The game's not over." Reynolds's tone shifted. "You're still thinking about that?" Evelyn was desperate. "Fraser, she was caught, on the verge of losing everything. She wasn't thinking clearly." "I know," Fraser replied, the words leaving her almost mechanically. "But what if there was more to it?" Evelyn wasn't someone to throw away words like that unless she had a reason. It didn't add up then, and it doesn't now. There was another long pause before Reynolds spoke again, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're reaching, Fraser. Larkin's confessed, and we have the evidence. What's the point in chasing ghosts?" Fraser didn't answer right away. She wasn't reaching. She knew it. She felt it. But there was a strange weight to Reynolds's words, a sense that he was content with the finality of the case. And that more than anything set her on edge. It was too easy to clean. "I think you're right," she said finally, her voice calm, but with an edge of something hard underneath. "It's over. For now. Good. I'll leave you to it." Then Reynolds replied, the relief clear in his voice. "Fraser, hung up the phone slowly, her thoughts still spinning. She stood up, walked to the window, and gazed out at the city below, bright lights flickering in the distance. People walking by in their own little worlds, unaware of the darkness that had just unfolded in their midst. She had solved the case, yes, but it hadn't felt like an end. It felt like a brief pause in something much larger, something more intricate, waiting just beyond the horizon. She thought back to Jane's words, the final, lingering look in her eyes when she had admitted everything. Jane had been a victim in her own way, caught between loyalty and fear. But Fraser had seen the cracks, the small moments where Jane's guilt had slipped through, the cracks in her carefully constructed for Wade. Then there was the phone call that had started the whole investigation, the anonymous tip that had seemed so perfectly timed. It had led them straight into a labyrinth of lies, manipulations, and the ultimate revelation that Samuel Larkin had been alive the whole time. And yet, there was something about that tip that still nagged at her, the way it had led them directly to the truth, almost as if someone wanted them to uncover the whole thing too perfectly, too conveniently. It was almost as if they had been expected to find it, to be led there. She couldn't shake the thought that there was someone else involved, someone behind the scenes pulling even more strings than they'd realized. With a frustrated sigh, Fraser turned away from the window and made her way back to her desk. She glanced over the case file one last time, her eyes scanning the familiar details: Samuel Larkin's arrest, Evelyn's confession, the corroborating evidence. And yet, that feeling remained. There was something wrong with how right everything had seemed. She picked up the phone again, dialing the number of a contact she hadn't used in years, an old informant, someone who had once been close enough to the underworld to know things no one else did. The line clicked, and a low voice answered. "You still alive, detective?" The voice asked. "I need you to look into something for me." Fraser replied, her tone businesslike, though her mind was miles away. A name, a contact, someone who might have been involved from the start. The informant's tone shifted instantly, curiosity replacing the gruffness. "I'll get back to you in a few hours. You sure you want to dig this up again? People don't like it when you start poking around." Fraser's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm sure. I think this case is far from over. But I need to know who's behind the shadows." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low chuckle. "I'll see what I can find." As the call ended, Fraser's mind raced. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. The mystery had led her through a maze of lies, deceit, and manipulation, but it wasn't just about Samuel Larkin. There was something else, something deeper, and it was only a matter of time before it all came back around again. She set the phone down and stared at the empty chair across from her, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment with the missing piece of the puzzle. But no one came. The case, for now, was quiet. And yet, that quiet hum of the city outside, the hum that had been so distant, so indifferent, felt like the sound of a new beginning. Fraser didn't know where it would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: this mystery had never ended. It had only just begun.